Thanks a lot for inviting us. We have prepared a little bit upbeat presentation, and there are some notes that we wrote so that we can manage everything in time. But in the beginning, before we start all of that, I'm just going to say a few words of what we will be talking about. Stealth Unlimited exists already now for 16 years. We started in 2000, and there was one of the questions that was put to us, like how did we decide to do what we do? And we were when we started to work together, that was actually before that, already in '96, we come from different contexts. Mark is Dutch, I'm Serbian. We decided to do our graduation project together, and that graduation project took us really long time and also shaped quite a lot our way of thinking and doing things. And once we finished our studies, we decided that we don't want to work for other people, that we want to start to do our own things and things that we believe in. It doesn't matter what financial consequences that might have for us. And somehow being persuasive and doing things this way actually worked out. Maybe we were lucky, maybe we were stubborn enough. I don't know what is the key to actually managing that.
Naive.
Maybe naive, I don't know. But we will now actually tell you a story about second phase of our work. Somehow we realized recently that we had from 2000 to 2008 like a first phase somehow of our work, and from 2008 to today somehow the other. I don't know if now the third one is starting, but somehow it also, I guess, will speak quite a lot about how do we see transition from a more research-based practice, curatorial also practiced, which was somehow start of this period from 2008, to something that is much more now community-driven work and engagement with certain groups of people. And there were 4 projects or 4 things that we will speak about. And the first 2 are biannuals, and you will see how biannuals made us actually shift to this other thing, and in a way, where we were somehow fed up with it and thought that it is time to go into something else.
So we want to take you today through a couple of experiences that have changed our perspective on architecture, and that journey starts in 2008. 2008 was the peak of the construction frenzy in much of Europe, fueled by real estate speculation, with signs were out all there for those who wanted to see it, that was soon going to crash upon us. And in that year, the Venice Biennial was held under the umbrella Architecture Beyond Building, and Anna and me, together with Saskia van Stein from the Architecture Institute, were curating together this pavilion. Actually, the burning down of the Faculty of Architecture in Delft, that's the school where I studied, in May of that same year, 2008, we took as a sign to rethink that sort of production of space and the profession that creates it. Let's say the burn down for us was a sort of a symbolic end. We and many others, coming from what at that time was labeled the alternative edge, felt that it's urgent to discuss what is to be done. We formulated 5 what we thought were fundamental questions on what architecture can contribute to society, and opened up that pavilion, that Dutch pavilion, to discuss them, to dispute them, to form a collective opinion about it, to debate it. And we captured that there, let's say, live in the space, in a set of publications that formed a possible direction of, let's say, curriculum of architecture. It is about things like collaboration, about social sustainability, about beyond power to empowerment, beyond the object. And it's also about making and unmaking. Generally, as architects, we don't know much about the unmaking of our stuff. In September of that year, NSA newspaper, which is one of the, you could say, one of the leading newspapers in the Netherlands, published a critique of the Dutch pavilion of that year's Venice Biennial, ridiculing this idea of refraining from celebrating the ongoing construction frenzy to contemplate on the purpose and the contribution of architecture to society. And you see here what it says: the Dutch pavilion shows nothing that looks like a building, but questions if thinking in terms of buildings still can address the issues and challenges awaiting us. Luckily, not everyone is so timid. So it didn't really kind of, compliment us. Ironically, while we were still there in Venice on September 15, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy, and actually our own bank in the Netherlands collapsed. There was a moment in which another society suddenly seemed in view. And 2 years ago, the same author of that newspaper critique released an article under the title, "The Feast of Super Dutch Construction is Over." You know, Super Dutch, this celebration of the Dutch production. It says, "The 2008 economic crisis has dealt a severe blow to Dutch architecture. New office buildings have become rare, and housing production has halved in 2013 compared to 2007. The decrease in number of architects was correspondingly from 15,000 in 2008 to 7,500 now." And for many, reality, practicing in the Netherlands at least, has obviously changed, and here is what the Spatial Planning Yearbook of 2012 says about that reality. In 2008, our field of work changed. However, it took a couple of years before we got aware of it. In the beginning, we thought it will pass. Meanwhile, we know that's a structural change. So what are actually these structural changes, at least from a Dutch perspective? By 2010, the change of political climate meant that the national policy on planning was at odds with the policy of liberalization. The crisis came in handy to break the more than 60 years of state involvement in planning and its institutions. They got dismantled to increase efficiency, to reduce costs, and to be ready for a new era. The Ministry of Housing, Spatial Planning and Environment disappears in that year, and with that the government gives up on the capacity of directing and formulating a national spatial policy or a public investment policy. While the position of the chief government architect remained, her field, it was her at that moment, her field of action was shifted from being one of the most important actors to becoming more or less a catcher of different species which were flying around. Those that could have a meaning for the transformation of the profession. And what are we looking at then? We see here a snapshot from 2014 from a web platform which is called "The Netherlands are Becoming Different." And that was powered by this Dutch state architect's office. And you see actually that the things which are featured on this portal are actually things which a couple of years before would never be featured on a state's architect's portal. It's much more ephemeral, much more sort of edge of architecture type of production. So the alternative is sought and made by those left in the field, now ready to act without institutional structure. So a lot of people who were into planning suddenly were lost. Their institutions were broken down. The spatial planning, which was so heavy in the Netherlands, suddenly had disappeared. So they were looking like what to do. They were uprooted, foodless, lost to a large degree, or searching. And here are some of the domains of action that they were in 2012, so 4 years after that crash, considering in their, let's say, in their yearbook. For instance, they were looking at the interim, temporary use, offering space for innovation, with this sort of illustrations. They were looking at the revolution of citizens' power, saying it's all about institutions. Or they were speaking about empowering a culture of self-construction, engagement as an answer to shrinkage. Artistic projects became orientation points for spatial planners. It looks like what was considered exotic or alternative practices only a couple of years before were seen suddenly as answers to some serious demands. Was it an act of desperation? Is that shift for architects and spatial planners a survival strategy? A desperate attempt to maintain a sphere of influence on spatial organization? Or are we in some way simply decorating the collapse? Should we be doing more relevant things instead? That uneasy feeling pushed us to rethink our own role in this, of which we'll hear a little bit more in a bit.
We have this complicated one. One press is this, the other that. So, so contours of a different city. So this question that we ask ourselves, if there are these difficult questions, where can we today search for practices that can offer a direction into different kind of future? In 2011, we were invited to curate another part of another biennial. It was in Bordeaux, in France, an urban biennial, mainly things happening outdoors, but there was also 3 large exhibitions, part of it, and the project was called Once Upon a Future. Around 2010, the city of Bordeaux and its metropolitan region started defining their strategy towards the year 2030, demarcating it with the riddle of usual targets like growth, economic development, or high standard real estate. Here you see the book in which all these kind of dreams were compiled. What Bordeaux officials are looking towards are growth to 1 million inhabitants from 750 to 1 million inhabitants. It's 1/4 of population. And large-scale development projects to be made mainly by external investors and developers. Here we see start of Era Atlantique project, which is similar to Era Méditerranée and Era Lille, which were made by these big investors coming in Lille, coming in Marseille, and now Bordeaux was their next target. And we see the mayor of Bordeaux at that time, also a prime minister of France, launching this project. A form of dark irony, of course, while society, in the midst of the economic crisis, which asks for a change in thinking and the agenda towards a more robust future that would confront a dealer class economy. This context was the context in which, when we came there in the beginning of 2011, we were asked to make an exhibition that would deal with the past, present, and future of urban development of Bordeaux, having in mind question of utopia, like what are utopian potentials today and in the future. And there was one other word which was mentioned to us, urban re-evolution. And this was introduced by the chief curator of the whole thing. It was Michelangelo Pistoletto, Italian famous artist from Arte Povera movement. Nowadays he's 80-something years old. At that time he was a bit less than 80. So that was the context in which we're supposed to work. Starting from the city strategic documents, like this book that you saw with 2030, which do not entrust Bordeaux's future and development to its citizens' hands, but to these big companies that come to do it for them, the project builds up upon the question, how can the agenda of making the metropolis be opened up? For a couple of months, actually 9 months, we spent there, and quite a bit of time we spend in trying to find groups that are today taking, let's say, this future into their own hands, or into common hands, better to say, that they display novel forms of collective organization and weave new forms of solidarity. So people who somehow search for this utopia, but from, let's say, microscopic utopia, and which believe in collective power rather than these top-down introduced things. Here are snapshots of some of these meetings that we did. Once the drives and the energies of these initiatives are put together and you spend months going around and meeting these groups, suddenly you start to see silhouette of another kind of society. You start to see different kind of city emerging in front of yourself. The images that you see here are products of the project. These are drawings of artists from Bordeaux who helped us to illustrate the story that we in the end make. So could this city, this silhouette, be based to propel us into a possible Bordeaux of 2030? To trigger the imagination, Once Upon a Future uses a fictional narrative written in collaboration with philosopher and writer Bruce Begot from Bordeaux and illustrated by dozens of graphic and comic artists from Bordeaux. The site of the exhibition was one of these sites targeted by this Era Atlantique project, site of a slaughterhouse, still functional at that time, which was supposed to be demolished for this big development project. For this fictional account of the future, the strategic agenda of the city has been taken as a base but given shape through the motives, tools, and activities of groups of citizens that already today explore a different collective peer production of the city by setting up an urban economy through productive clusters to achieve a more resilient more sustainable development, or commonly looking for different ways to live and make housing in speculation, defying ways that oppose individualism and competition, but practice collaboration, mutualization, and common ownership or management of resources. Here we see this mayor of the city, and at that time, as I said, foreign minister of France at the exhibition, where we are telling this story and he does not believe us. So there is really this question, why it's so difficult for politicians and for people in charge of these long-term plans to actually take in account what is really happening on the ground, what people are actually already doing. Why is that future so unthinkable? In the story that we made, there is a moment where there is an enlightened female mayor in 2030 who decides to take things in a different direction. There is institutional and political shift to allocate much more active forms of citizenship and give them the right to the city. This project suggested different direction from what the city does and caused considerable nervousness with the municipality and our local partners, but did not shake the status quo. So somehow after this project, there was this question that came to us, who and on which premises construct the city's common interest when politicians and planners actually don't. So we felt the need to engage in this direction in a more grounded and long-term way. And here is our exhausted moment after setting up this exhibition, and in a way that was somehow the point where we were thinking, okay, maybe now we should shift from running around and doing this project for other people and in places where we actually cannot continue doing them, because that was our frustration, that after 11 months spending there, investing all our time and energy to somehow connect these groups, where we saw potential of bringing them together into this circle of exhibition, others there locally didn't see it. So we said, okay, we live here, but maybe we can, in places where we live, try to do something which would have more grounded and deeper impact. And that's how we come to these two things that we will tell you about now. They're, interestingly enough, both connected to housing. And the first one will take us to Belgrade, which is not so far from here, and the other one is in Rotterdam. So disassembling the housing issue. A little bit of statistics for the beginning. So what housing can average citizen in Belgrade afford? With a household income of 520 euro per month, which I guess is similar to here, and the price per square meter of apartment of 1,400 euro, housing has become a sheer impossibility for those that do not have this money. That is a huge percentage of population. In Belgrade, buying an apartment of 55 square meters takes 22 years of your entire salary without any other costs.
No food.
No food. Much of the housing production takes place in a gray economic zone with shady investors, sometimes unregistered cash payments, and partially illegal construction. Some new built apartments, for instance, cannot be enlisted in the property register in the cadastre because they are illegal. Still people buy them. Such housing development has often been accompanied by fraud, where one and the same apartments are sold 2 or more times, making the purchase of the apartment dangerous game with an uncertain outcome. And here we see a protest of an association of citizens called 1000 Deceived. It was somewhere in 2008 or 2009. Actually, these buildings had never been finished, and these people paid for these apartments in advance. The investment was stalled, and they stayed without money and without place to live. This whole boom and construction boom started somewhere around 2003. Before that, a lot of construction was illegal, but people were constructing for themselves. Actually, that was our research project when we started with STELT, was dealing with informal, illegal, basically construction and possibilities where that could actually take us as profession if we collaborate with people who do these kind of things. From 2003, this somehow became past or became less present. What became much more present in these kind of developments where credits are the main drive of development, and introduction of foreign banks was actually the reason why this whole thing came about. Here we see an image from Croatian coast, Erste Mobile bankomat on the beach. However, the luxury of credit is not in reach for everyone, and with many people in their 40s with no choice but to live with their parents or grandparents, messages like this one on this billboard where this small girl says, "Do you also have your own apartment sipping a coffee?" Suddenly become very cynical. And this billboard produced quite a lot of outcry with people, and it was quickly taken off from the streets. Other options at hand are also not very promising, like 150,000 people just in Belgrade who are paying excessive rents on the unprotected private market, while only 2% of housing is social rental. 15% of people live in overpopulated apartments. So how did we get there? In the year 1992, privatization of societally owned apartments took place for relatively small amounts of money. These were apartments that people were investing while they were working in their companies in the time of socialist Yugoslavia, putting money into common housing fund from which apartments were then developed. They got rights to live there, but they were not the owners. Not everyone's housing situation was resolved. Like 60% of people in Yugoslavia lived in these sort of developments, 40% of people lived in private housing. What happened in 1992 is that for relatively small amounts of money, people could buy out these apartments, couple of 100 German marks, and suddenly they got a market value. And there started this crazy period of wheeling and dealing of real estate, people moving, selling, moving out of the country, people shifting their places where they lived. With this, the housing policy basically evaporated. In total, today, 97% of the housing stock became private. What this meant is that for all the other generations to come, situation turned into everyone for themselves model. You figure it out. We as a state have nothing else to do with this. With very few exceptions, the state housing policy would until today not create conditions for affordable housing. It would actually turn even more sour. What you see is a billboard of Belgrade waterfront development project worth 3.5 billion euro, and we already saw this or another image of the same project from Mark Minkian. In partnership with United Arab Emirates, project of national interest. For this project, laws and legislation, even almost constitutions has been changed for this project to become project of national interest. How can you justify that the shopping mall and the office tower are a project of national interest where you as a state actually give land and even infrastructure to a developer which makes this for apartments that cost 3,000 euro per square meter? Offering us a new chapter in living. Impossible to reach for a huge percentage of population. Its name in English, Belgrade Waterfront, tells us enough that it is not meant to be for local people at all. So is another reality possible? Can we unplug from unsustainable housing loan debts? Here we see people who have unpayable mortgages in Swiss francs protesting for a year already on streets of Belgrade. Social stigmatization in a very few areas of social housing. Energy poverty with many people being unable to pay their bills. Here protests of people from Niš, mainly pensioners. Irresponsible institutions, and state politics that proclaim luxury real estate developments projects of national importance. Here a protest of the initiative Don't Let Belgrade Down or Drown, that since 2014 mobilizes against the Belgrade waterfront development, and this is image from the 6th protest which took place on the 29th of September. This gives you a picture why in the end of 2012 with platform Who Builds the City, Ko gradi grad in Serbian, we decided to place this announcement. Are you interested in building a decent apartment somewhere in Belgrade at 300, 400, 500 euro per square meter without getting yourself into debt and unpayable loans, living in impossible conditions, or waiting for your relatives to move to the countryside or heaven? Impossible? So we started from this premise that the mentioned prices are the only realistic ones for majority. Our intention is to offer a step out of the market-driven norm of resolving housing, seeing it as a social construct, not a natural condition. So it's not natural that it is like this. We can change it, but there should be a will for it. Therefore, it is necessary to disassemble the problem and put it back together in a different way. We call the initiative Smarter Building, and our meetings were usually held in a cultural center, Rex, in Belgrade. So it is open to people willing to become co-initiators, co-designers, co-financers, maybe even co-builders, physically building. About 30 of us decided to give it a go, and in the beginning, the first thing that we did, we spoke about motivations and reservations towards this kind of thing, and reasons for people to join something like this. For many, there was existential reason, lack of own living space, or mortgage takes us into slavery kind of way of thinking, or professional interest among many architects which do things that they don't believe in, have this schizophrenic like split of their personality. They're designing in a day something that they have nightmares during the night, and they would like to see a shift from that. And another overarching reason was political concern that this issue needs to be addressed, and that we have to be actually persistent and courageous in the way to get it through. There were, of course, also reservations, like the main one. One of the main ones, like, are we performing the job of the state? But as we see, the state is not doing it, so obviously not. And another concern, which I think is a legitimate one, is, are we entering the field of these real estate sharks, guys who are doing this, basically mafia? What are consequences of doing it, actually? Because you see that their prices are much higher and they have huge profits of it. We had no plan how to get there, just some questions from which to start. The first one to dissect was the price construct. So what is really this price? Following by the individual ownership. Is it necessary that everyone owns their own apartment? Can there be some other construct? And speculation or profit making. As a result, coming to conclusion that in this model, housing can be no commodity. Summarize, the aim is to showcase possibility of collective self-development and use of housing for sustainably lower price than the market, including different income groups, that is replicable, that can be repeated and others can repeat it, and non-speculative. And the last one, and that's the last, is within 5 years, it's there on the last place because we are not sure we will manage in that time. So with the Smarter Building group, we decided to work out our concept. So the first question was this affordable price, and we looked at the statistics and found out that the average what people can and pay in Serbia is 15% of average household income for apartment and utilities. Of course, many people own apartments, so this is much lower for those that own than those that took credit. But we said, okay, is it possible for 15% out of 520 to make some, to construct and be able to pay bills later, which is 80 euro per month, which is quite a low amount of money. With the radical reduction of the utility costs like heating, there might be finances available to invest into construction. And if we want to keep it low cost and do it ourselves construction, it also means a different way of thinking. Like, for instance, the mode cell system based on main construction elements bearing wall panels of wood filled with straw bales. They're super insulating, fire resistant, and can be completely made of local material, easily built up to 3 floors, like here, used by Lilac Cooperative in Leeds, in England. Exploring the best way to go, we came up with the housing cooperative as a proposal construct that would act as a developer for a collective of individuals. It would also provide financing options for its members, and housing cooperatives have a tradition in Serbia, 100 years old, more than 100 years old, but have been derailed and went into market actually direction. We determined an optimal size of 40 housing units on a various sizes to start with. And this number is some kind of resilient number. If people disappear, drop out, that the whole thing does not implode. And on the other hand, it's not too large a group that you cannot still have a conversation altogether. All the cooperatives invest additionally 10% into common spaces. In such a way, it gets possible to organize, for instance, in such a building, 250 square meters of common spaces, like a common living room or a guest room or a laundry, and spaces like a co-working or a communally run restaurant. This model allows for a wide variety of participants, from those with average income to people that fall under the category of social help. And we saw three ways of investing. One is for people that have money at the beginning, ones that would monthly invest into it, and even possibility to somehow contribute through work and not necessarily financial. Still, it is considerable amount of money for these 40 apartments, and this construction that we made, it would cost 1.7 million euro. So how do we get there? So we decided this year to spend a lot of time on discussing actually economy that could help this come through. Coming to even thinking that maybe it's necessary to establish a financial institution ourselves, starting maybe from a small common savings pool, but even possibly end up with a cooperative bank. And here we see an interesting example of an ethical cooperative bank from Croatia, under establishment of which we also became members by now, but it cannot help finance projects in Serbia. The other option we are working on is establishing a community-led company for production of this kind of paneling system that we saw, and ultimately understanding housing not only as something which you have to pay for, but as the site of community economy, producing energy, food, elements of a neighborhood economy. With that, we are looking at a sustainable life in the city.
Here we come to the last part of what we would like to speak about today. These things, like for instance becoming a bank yourself, is one of the things we are finding out, that we have to become experts in capacities that are actually unknown to us in order to test them, so we'll be able to put those things to work for us. For the last part of the talk, we'll take you to Rotterdam, where we set up an initiative called City in the Making. And since 2014, City in the Making started working with empty buildings to achieve what their owner cannot do any longer, and that's to, let's say, to let them contribute to our city with the help of a group of passionate citizens. City in the Making has opened up a handful of previously boarded up or vacant buildings and restored them in a very, very, very basic way for living and working. Currently there are 4 premises in Rotterdam North. We are actually at the 6th premise, I think, right now. All in the vicinity of the central station, so we are not speaking about the periphery of town, but actually about relatively close to the center of town. And we see the current temporary use of the buildings, because all the buildings which we have in temporary use. We see that as a training condition for what is yet to come. So for us, the next step is to go beyond this temporary exploitation of vacant properties that have been brought to us or to our disposal as consequences of that financial crisis. So this is what it is all about, an experiment on urban economy and exchange. And it starts from the same thing which you saw already before. So it started and currently thrives in this afterlife of the 2008-2009 economic crisis. Crisis that started out with toxic debts, real estate speculation. Amidst that unfolding financial crisis in the year 2009, a non-for-profit housing developer, it's called Havenstede, they have 40,000 houses in Rotterdam, bought these 2 buildings with the idea to demolish and redevelop them. At that time, 2009, in Holland, this crisis got introduced a little bit later. It might be still on the edge of a reasonable thing to do so. However, it was not for long. Following that mortgage crisis, which got really heavy in 2010-2011 in the Netherlands, for real estate owners like Havenstede, the context in which they find themselves operating changed dramatically. And a number of things are actually happening at the same time. Quite suddenly, a substantial discrepancy occurs between the value of their real estate portfolio in the books and the real, or in the value which it has in the actual economy. So there's between 20% gap between what the value is in their books, in their accounting, in their schemes, and the value out there, let's say, on the street. And that made actually, that brought down their entire value with millions and millions of euros. And in the years leading up to the crisis, the group of non-for-profit housing developers to which this owner belongs moved away from their core task in providing affordable housing towards other products with a higher return. for instance, they went into casinos or housing for elderly people in Greece. Well, we know where Greece ended up, so not all of that was per se a very smart investment. Suddenly that resulted in financial deficiencies of billions of euros, like for instance also in the case of Vestia, another housing corporation or cooperative corporation in Rotterdam, which had taken risk positions, derivatives on the stock market for nearly 10 billion euros, and which lost almost €1 billion on that. So together, all these housing corporations, they pitch in to save, to rescue their weaker brothers, and that made a serious dent in their financial reserves. So suddenly they are rather poor organizations. And now Havestede finds itself in the situation where it no longer can sustain part of its real estate portfolio. It has to focus on keeping healthy parts of its housing stock in place. And buildings like these, and these are the buildings we are working with, fall out of that scope. For them, the only viable solution was demolition, but there is no money for new construction, so they've become toxic assets for them. And what we did is that we asked the owner how much it would actually cost to keep these buildings empty. And they would take, let's say, they were ready to take a loss of about 60,000 euros for the next 8 to 10 years to come. And we decided to make a quite unconventional proposition to them. So they were ready over a period of 10 years, 8 to 10 years, to take 60,000 loss. And we said, why don't you give us the 60,000 in year 0, immediately, upfront to us, and we'll take the remaining risks and all what comes, you know, with maintaining and keeping these buildings up out of your hands, under the condition that we can operate independently without financial obligations to the owner. So in short, we could in some way common it, take it into common use for a period of 10 years. And to do that, we formed an association, City in the Making, basically with the idea that let's see if this can be done differently than how the owner is imagining it, and if we can actually keep buildings open rather than having to close them off, board them up in the center of Rotterdam. And the first phase of that basically centered on the details of an Excel sheet, basically the challenge how to break even and keep going for 10 years. It was something we had never done before, so we also were just basically finding out how that could be done. From that initial investment budget of Havestede, so the 60,000 which they were willing to, let's say, to give to us in the year 0 instead of accumulating that as a loss over a period of 10 years, 75% is reserved for contractors' costs. Basically, we had to save the buildings because they were about to collapse. And we decided to execute half of that work ourselves, and with that we also got, let's say, we got control over half of that reserved budget, which we could now time or prioritize completely differently than an organization like this real estate owner would normally do. So what we did is that we diverted a large part of that budget from the exterior repairs to the interiors in order to make the spaces usable, inhabitable, and to create a small cash flow, because that was really needed for us. Otherwise we could not keep it up and running for 10 years. For the owner, Havestede, it's a deal with an untested partner. They had never done anything with us. However, it was appealing for them. No financial risks, no contingencies, no management costs, yet no less economic result, or actually their loss, let's say, would be the same. So in October 2013, we signed the agreement, and we almost immediately started to work on the site because the buildings were in ruin, and we quite quickly had to make them inhabitable to get some income going and not to default, for instance, on the property tax, which would be soon arriving from the city hall and stuff like that. We decided to think things on intuitively. There was only one rule up front, and that we could not spend more than what we have at a given moment. Largely in retrospect, we can reconstruct the approach which we have taken. I'm going to take you through it fairly quickly. One thing was to understand the building as a self-sustaining entity in economic, social and environmental terms. So we wanted to build a structure where each of these buildings could take care of itself and was not kind of depending on each other or on, on subsidies, external funding. Where possible, we try to replace monetary flows with non-monetary alternatives. For instance, instead of charging rent, we would much more welcome if people who are in the buildings would help, through physical labor to maintain the buildings. That would be making much more sense in economic terms. We split the building in two parts, sort of a vertical and horizontal part, but we literally also split the buildings, the ground floors and the floors above. The floors above generate a little bit of income to keep us afloat, but also to keep the ground floors open as common spaces which can be used in the community, whether that community is in the house, in the street, in the neighborhood, or in the city. It depends how you define that community for what use. It was very important to keep financial pressure away from these common spaces on the ground floor, so that we could start experimenting with things there without immediately these things having to make some money to pay for rent. So we wanted to keep that more or less free from economic pressure. All investments must be earned from income of rents before they can be executed. We had some pioneering economies quite immediately started, which is also good to understand that it's not only about living there, but actually also about working, about how do we survive in this city. One thing was a wood workshop. Another thing which quite quickly came up was a sort of a community brewery, and a mini laundry which developed, which started basically from the need to put that that laundry machine somewhere. No one wanted to have it in the house because it eats space. So actually the house hacked us, put it in the ground floor, and then came up with the idea to open it up to the rest of the street. And it's actually really being used by a couple of the neighbors in the streets. That was a nice side effect of it. As we said, we see that current temporary use of buildings as a training ground for what is yet to come. And the next step is to go beyond that temporary exploitation of vacant properties. We also understand that we can be there as long as there is an economic crisis. That's not a very sustainable or very sort of happy future. So we are looking at ways how to do that differently. After having worked for quite a while, we decided to pen down our ambitions for the time to come. Here you have them. Basically, it's about taking property from the market and bringing it into collective ownership for affordable housing and working. That is, I mean, you can maybe read the rest very quickly, but this is basically what the whole thing is about. So to take these buildings as resources, take them out of the market so they don't have to continue in this cycle of booms and bursts of like this idea that we have to make an economy from speculation on real estate, but actually to lock them and to make them affordably available for communities. Here we come actually to the end of what we wanted to tell to you. Maybe you see that a couple of the clues or inspirations which we have taken come actually from, for instance, the cooperative movement, which especially the early cooperative movements from, let's say, 150 years ago, groups who found themselves in cities where they had difficulty to survive, which therefore started to organize themselves, and not just for themselves but also for others. If you look at the manifest of the cooperative movement, it always has this item of going out to the world and educate others of how to set up similar structures to make yourself more resilient. And I think that has been a very important finding for us in these last years, and also brought us much closer to the work, with the work which we are doing, to the actual things in the city, the actual issues going on, up to the point where you realize that it's really about you. It's not about doing services for others, but we actually do these services also for ourselves. So that is somewhere where we would like to leave it for now. Thanks.